With violent and mature-rated games like Grand Theft Auto and Halo raking in millions for the video game industry, some parents are wondering where to turn to find more wholesome games for their children. And to capture that market, some game developers are creating titles for the so-called Christian gamers. This past weekend, that emerging gaming market was the focus of the 4th annual Christian Game Developers Conference. But are violent and mature games really that bad for our kids? And what would the focus of so-called Christian games be? Joining us tonight in the studio is Chris Skaggs, founder of Soma Games. And joining us by phone is Stephen Johnson, author of the book Everything Bad is Good for You. Thank you both for being with us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So Chris, as a consumer, what do you think of this Grand Theft Auto controversy?
I think from the consumer angle, any controversy has the opportunity to both boost sales and restrict sales. There's always that cutting edge at which point you've generated interest and people want to know more about it, and then that point where you've just offended too many people and they start running away. I think at this point now, Rockstar has probably crossed over that cutting edge, and they're going to feel it. Sony's going to have about a $50 million bust here if I was just to give or take a few dollars, and that's a big problem.
So do you think that these controversies are increasing the demand for more wholesome video games?
I think they are, but more importantly, I think they're increasing the attention to the fact that there is such a thing. By and large, this controversy has a way of drawing attention to an industry that, for the most part, has been pretty quiet up to now. There's not a lot of awareness that Christian or family-friendly video games even exist. So the ability for people to look for alternatives when they see things that they find to be unwholesome or distasteful, it's just nice to see the extra attention going to a better product.
So, Stephen, you've written this book called Everything Bad is Good for You, a very catchy title, if I might add. And in it, you contend that these video games are actually not making us a more violent culture, but a smarter culture. How so?
That's right. I mean, I really tried to look at in the book at the question of, not the question of values, to really put the question of values on the side and say other people can have that argument, but to look exclusively at how much problem solving do you have to do to complete your average video game today? How complex are these games? How challenging are they mentally? Because we focus almost exclusively on this question of the violence and the values, and we never really talk about how difficult the games have become over the last 15 or 20 years. They're really, really complicated structures, and kids are doing very complicated forms of thinking when they engage with these games. So I think that they're actually getting a kind of a great kind of mental workout when they play a lot of these games. Now, some of them are too violent, and certainly games like Grand Theft Auto are not appropriate for kids. But by focusing exclusively on Grand Theft Auto, we're missing all the really interesting games that are out there that are being played and that are really popular.
I was going to ask you, do you think that there are complex reasoning skills within Grand Theft Auto?
Well, I think that of all the violent games, Grand Theft Auto is a little bit more interesting in the sense that it's a very open-ended structure. You have a lot of different options. The world you explore is very large. You're not just running around shooting at things the way you can in some other games. But it's certainly not my favorite game, and you know, I think that there are much more interesting ones that are out there that are also bestsellers.
So you think that this sort of attention around all the violence in video games is overblown?
Well, it's a very interesting thing. I mean, the question is, the core question, I think, is whether that, you know, fictional media violence of playing a video game translates into some kind of real-world violence. And we've had this great experiment over the last 10 years, basically, where video games really weren't violent at all 10 years ago because just the graphics weren't there yet. And then we've had more and more violent games come out over the last 10 years, and they've become a more mainstream, form of culture and recreation for kids. And during that time, we've seen the most dramatic drop in youth crime that we've seen since we started keeping this kind of records. So if there is, in effect, a relationship between violence on the screen and violence in real life, it's very, very small. Otherwise, we wouldn't have seen that huge drop.
So, Chris, I want to ask you, you have a company called Soma Games, which is going to be marketing and making Christian video games for consumers. What do you do in a Christian video game?
The question's a little bit vague there because
it is a vague question.
The notion of a Christian video game is a broad one in the first place. If I were to say this for a Christian coffee cup, what does that mean exactly?
Right.
There are certainly games that are explicitly Christian, that are explicitly religious, and they tend to be pretty didactic. They'll be using biblical characters, or they'll be using biblical principles if they're Christian. But there are similarly games that teach other religious structures. There's a game right now. Oh, I'm going to forget the name, but it's a Hindu-based game.
Bible trivia?
That's another Christian game, but there are other games, just about every religion you can think of, that are teaching the principles of these religions. What's a broader base right now in the Christian gaming market are games that are only informed by the Christian worldview, and they're not explicitly Christian at all. And if you didn't speak the language, you wouldn't recognize that it's a Christian game, or maybe if you didn't know the developers, you wouldn't suspect that that content's there. But they're subtly. It teaches values. It teaches the kind of things that are part of the Christian way of looking at the universe.
Now, life during the time of Christ was not non-violent.
That's very
Is
true.
there violence in Christian video games?
Right now, that's a debate that's inside the industry. Most of the video games in the Christian industry right now are targeted for young kids, and so there's not a lot of violence. But as the industry matures, there's no doubt that they're going to start moving towards a more mature audience, towards teens and adults, and they'll start to be competing against games like Halo or like Grand Theft Auto in the same marketplace. And in that case, they're likely to include a certain amount of violence. But the question isn't violence for violence sake. The question is about context. And the debate in the church is the same that it's been in the world, is that where and in what circumstances is violence or the use of force ever appropriate?
Okay. So, but I do have to ask you, I
Yep.
mean, is it violence in the name of God is okay if it's under the heading of a Christian video game?
I would have to say it's a rather provocative question, and it's meant to be.
That's what I meant to ask
I
you,
know.
a provocative question.
The notion of putting violence in the name of God is always going to be a bell ringer for people, and I would say no, that's not what the purpose is going there. But it would be an equally fair question to say, in what name is violence ever appropriate? And that's a question that everybody answers. Is it appropriate to have violence in no name, which seems to be what Grand Theft Auto was suggesting, that it's just wanton, it has no connection, it has no consequence? Or is there violence for a purpose, to defend to defend villages? I don't know. These are the sort of things that go in on every video game, and it's not unique to Christian video games.
But what do you actually do? Do you like build Noah's Ark? What do you do?
In some games you're building Noah's Ark. A lot of Christian games are dominated by puzzles, so you're rearranging pieces, or the first segment the guy talked about, platformers, where you're just running around jumping over things and collecting prizes. They're just fun. They don't have violence at all or any implication of violence.
Now, Stephen, you don't think that when kids are sitting fixated in front of their televisions or in front of their video games, kind of like zombies, that parents need to be worried about this? You think that when kids are fixated like that, they're actually really focused. They're not sort of zoned out.
Well, the first thing I would say is to separate out those two activities that you just grouped together. That there is as much difference between focusing on an interactive screen when you're playing a game and focusing on a passive medium like television as there is between those two activities and reading a book. We talk sometimes about screen time as if it's all just the same thing, but in fact you're doing much more mental work. You're thinking, you're analyzing, you're looking for patterns, you're thinking about your objectives, and you're making decisions every second of every video game when you play a video game, whereas when you watch television, you're basically just kind of passively consuming what somebody else has come up with. So the first thing parents should do is to realize that there are two very different kinds of mental activities that are going on, whether you're playing a video game or watching a TV show. That said, if the kids are out there playing 6 hours of even the best video game, it's time for them to go and throw a ball around outside. I mean, I think everything, I'm arguing for kind of a balanced media diet here. But part of that is in recognizing that there are some healthy components to the gameplay that the kids are engaging in today, and it's not just kind of rotting their minds.
Okay, fair enough. What are you hoping, Chris, that these video games, Christian video games, will do? That they'll provide an alternative to parents who don't want their kids to be exposed to more mainstream violence in video games? Or are you also sort of hoping that you might convert some non-believers?
I think that what Mr. Johnson's saying is absolutely true, and I agree with him 100%.
You agree that everything bad is good for you?
I didn't say, what I agree is that there's nothing better in the world, no better tool than games to teach things. And games provide what I like to call an emotionally relevant response. You're practicing these things that resonate in your heart, that resonate in things, and whether or not you know it or not, you're learning these skills, you're practicing these tasks. So when we talk about a game that has a lot of complex structures, a big world to explore, that's a positive thing. It increases your ability to think critically. The question goes back to, in what context is this happening? And am I exploring things like stealing cars and stealing TVs and beating up women, or am I exploring things like defending good values? And even if it's more in the middle about, just you're a space marine fighting against the aliens, there's a context here about how you're learning these things. And we would never send our kid to a school that actually taught how to steal cars and beat up women, but yet in a certain way that's kind of what happens with a game like Grand Theft Auto. So Christian video games try to provide a context to learn the same kinds of skills, the same kinds of entertainment, but with the same kind of emotional context that's consistent with a Christian worldview or just with a family-friendly worldview. It's not always explicit. It's not always didactic.
So it's not always about conversion.
I don't know that I've ever seen this one about conversion. Now, there may be an exception I'm not aware of, but I've never seen one that's trying to convert anybody.
How do you market a Christian video game? Are there obstacles to doing that?
There are. The secular market is just now starting to be penetrated by Christian titles. And what it comes down to is a great analog is about 20 years ago, the Christian music industry was a bunch of people making music in their garage. It didn't have a lot of quality going on, and no disrespect, but it was just something where a lot of people who loved what they were doing, and they were doing it for only that reason. But as money comes into the market, they're able to have better equipment, better programmers, well, in video game programmers. And so what's happening with the video game market is it's just starting to evolve in the same way that the Christian music industry did. Now, right now, Christian music, I think, last I heard, makes up to 10% of the total music sales. That's a huge market segment, and it's continuing to grow. And it's heard on secular stations in the same way. And I suspect that Christian video games are really poised to do the exact same thing. Video games, as a rule, will probably move a lot faster. The technology is what drives it. And so the penetration will probably happen a lot quicker than it did in music.
And what is this game that we're looking at right here on Soma Games? What is this?
That is a title called Titus and Timothy. Now, I'm sorry, that's a mistitle. Soma Games doesn't make that. That is a title that was created to be explicitly about Christian characters. Titus and Timothy are two of the first century saints, and they do a great job. Another title out there is from Digital Praise. They do all the Adventures in Odyssey games. Brethren Entertainment does awesome work. I think I gave you some titles from the Rebel Planet.
Right.
And that's going to be a more adult game. People that are used to that, it's a fantasy role-playing game with swords and spiders and big dinosaurs. And so it really spans the gamut here of what's going on.
Good, and I want to ask you one question, Stephen, before we go. Do you think that all of these video games are contributing to less reading? Kids are reading fewer books because they're so fixated on these games.
I think they're doing less of everything. Really. I mean, I think there's just so many more media options that have exploded in the last 10 years. I mean, one interesting change that I think is fascinating is that they're watching less professional sports because they want to play the simulated versions of professional sports on their game consoles. And that, to me, is a perfectly positive trend. They're going from just sitting there passively watching other people do sports to actively managing teams and strategizing, coming up with all these different, kind of approaches to the game. So, yeah, they're probably reading a little bit less, but they're writing more because of email and the internet. So I'm not too worried about the state of the kids right now. I think they're probably doing fine.
Okay, great. Well, I want to thank you so much, Stephen Johnson, author of Everything Bad is Good for You, and here in the studio, Chris Skaggs of Soma Games. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Well, it's time to roll up your sleeves and put on your work boots, because coming up next on Nite, we're getting down and dirty, bringing you as close as we're sure you'll want to get